everybody. Today, Hani is going to continue reading Wonka, inspired by Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Chapter 2, Scrubitt and Bleacher. Willie lay shivering on a park bench, too cold to sleep. He'd placed his top hat over his face, but even that wasn't enough to stop his nose from icing over. He was staring into the dark, empty at best of the inside of the hat, dreaming up ways to his shop, when he heard a knock. Not just one, but three deliberate knocks. Knock, knock, knock. He pulled a lever attached to the rim, and the top of the hat flapped open to reveal a stocky, broken-toothed man standing over him. Woof! And an equally stocky but excellently toothed dog. "You all right there?" the man asked. Fine, thank you," Billy managed. "A little colder than I expected." "You must be new in town," he said. "I'm Bleacher, and this dog is Tittles." "Willy Wonka. I just arrived. I'm beginning to wish I'd come in the height of summer." "This is the height of summer," Bleacher said, laughing. "You're not planning to sleep here, are you?" Unfortunately, Willie attempted a big frown, but his face was too frozen for it. "I seem to have lost what little money I had. I was planning on sleeping in a nice warm hotel." "Ah," the one man said. "Well, as luck would have it, I knew someone who can help you." "Really?" Willie said, his mood immediately warming. "Yes," Bleacher said. "Come with me." Willie unstuck himself from the frozen bench and shuffled after Bleacher, who was already taking big stalking strides ahead. "Thank you," Willie said, hurrying to catch up. "Thank you hugely, sir." Bleacher grinned. "Don't mention it. Tittles and I are always on the lookout for a stranger in need. Aren't we, boy?" Tittles growled, and Willie clutched his case tighter. "This is not far," Bleacher said, and he glanced back at Willie. "Right behind you," Willie said, and sawing beautifully with his brisk walk. Bleacher grinned. "Good." "What luck," Willie murmured. "I'm so glad to have met you." "Me too," Bleacher said in a voice so close to a growl the dog could have said it. "Me too." Bleacher led Willie through the carved alleyways all the way to the outskirts of the city. They walked in silence, and soon the roar rumble of the city faded into the dark, until all that could be heard was the sound of their echoing footsteps from the occasional growl from the dog. "Sorry about Tittles, by the way," Bleacher eventually piped up. "He seems to have taken a liking to your backside." Willie tapped his chin and thought, I bet it's not my bottom. It will be my trousers. They're vintage, actually. I got them from a postman." "Funny fellow, aren't you?" Bleacher said. "That'd be it. Tittles would spend all day running after postmen if he could. Won't you, boy?" The dog gave a grunt that sounded surprisingly like a gruff yes. Bleacher halted and pointed ahead, down the dark alleyway. "Well, there it is, Mr. Wonka. Home sweet home." Up ahead was a crumbling building. It was tall, about 5 stories high, and with every floor Willie's eyes traveled up. The place got more and more lopsided. At the very top, jutting out from the side, was an old wooden bird coop, alive with pigeons cooing hauntingly in the silence. Willie's eyes followed the building down, past window frames that had popped out and were hanging there like glassy bats. Some of the windows were barred, and the ground floor window was shuttered for the night. "Scrubitt and Bleacher, guest house and laundry," Bleacher boomed as he reached the door. "Bleacher?" Willie said. "It's you!" "It's mostly her," Bleacher said, pulling a bell. Before the bell had even finished singing, a harsh, grunting voice sounded from behind the door. "If it's you, Bleacher, you'd better have that warm water." "Oh, we've got something better than warm water, Mrs. Scrubitt. We've got a gift." There was a clink and a clunk, and the shut on the door opened to reveal a roving eye. Willie beamed, and the eye widened hungrily. "What a charming greeting!" Willie said securely at the door that was jerked open, revealing a squat woman with slicked back hair, for something whose job it was to make things clean. She was surprisingly greasy. Her teeth was covered in a gray sludge, and 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 as she smiled, Willie was sure he saw something slimy slither between them. "Come on in, sir," she said as Willie tipped hat to her and stepped inside. The place was a mess. Bundles of smelly clothes lay on risky shelves, collapsing under the weight of so much washing. The only light, a spatter-like chandelier, was dim and dusty and flickered as Willie moved around the room. He spotted a dumbwaiter in the wall, a small elevator-like contraption to carry the washing down to the washhouse. He peeked down to the shaft, but he could see nothing but darkness. "Welcome to Scrubitt and Bleacher, Guest House and Laundry. I'm Mrs. Scrubitt, the big boss. You make yourself at home. Warm your chuckles by the fire. Warm water?" "Oh, Willie began, but Mrs. Scrubitt interrupted him. "Noodle!" she screeched. Immediately a swollen and scruffy little serving girl came sliding into the room. She was holding a book in her hand and snapped it shut as she skidded on a halt in front of them. Willie offered her a smile, but she snapped her head away to avoid his gaze, almost as quickly as she had closed her book. "Put that silly book away and fetch our guest a glass of warm water," Mrs. Scrubitt boomed. "Poor man's frozen half to death." Noodle turned her back to them and immediately began busying herself, raising a glass here and uncorking a bottle there. As soon as Squirt came out, the most spirited smell filled the room, soaring up Willie's nose and sticking the back of his throat. It smelled like someone had taken a swamp full of dead things and added mustard and vinegar to it. He began to gag, but much to his surprise, Mr. Scrubitt had taken good big sniffs and oohing and eyeing as it smelled utterly wonderful. Noodle placed a glass of gloopy gray smudge into Willie's hand and fixed him with the apologetic stare. "Warm water," Mrs. Scrubitt said. "There's nothing more glorious." "Thank you," Willie said with a gulp. He thought he spotted something slithering through his grip. "You and your husband have been most kind to you." "Husband?" Mrs. Scrubitt spat. She turned to Bleacher. "Oh, you'd like that, wouldn't you?" "No," Bleacher lied. "I'm holding out for someone better," Mrs. Scrubitt explained. "A marquess, or something, a prince." She stalked across the room and nudged a glass of warm water closer to Willie's lips. "Drink up!" They both drank, and Willie immediately gasped. "That's extremely powerful stuff." He managed something definitely siled down his throat. Mrs. Scrubitt licked some springy gray bits from the corners of her mouth, making horrible slurping sound between the munching and squirching. When she finally gulped down the last drop and licked the glass for good measure, she said, "Now, Mr. Wonka, what can I do for you? A room, is it?" "Well, yes, but Willie paused, feeling embarrassed. Mrs. Scrubitt flushed. Bleacher smiled. "You don't say, Mr. Wonka." "I'm afraid it's true, Mrs. Scrubitt," Willie said. I have not a silver gain to my name, but if my prognostications are correct, all that's about to change." "Oh, yeah," Mrs. Scrubitt said. "See, I'm something of a magician, inventor, and chocolate maker. I've spent the past 7 years traveling the world, perfecting my craft, and first thing tomorrow at the Galeries Gourmet, I plan to unveil my most astonishing creation yet. Prepare to be amazed. As I present you," he reached into his hand and pulled out a teapot, Mrs. Scrubitt said flatly. "Huh?" Will said before noticing he had indeed pulled a teapot from his head. "Oh, it's not that. They were invented ages ago, mate," Bleacher said. Billy put the teapot back and started rummaging through the hat again. The other stared as he pulled out a string of a handkerchief, a bunch of carrots, somewhere inside the hat. An angry nouch sounded. Sorry, it's in there somewhere, Willie muttered. Noodles gave a laugh. Don't you worry, Mr. Wonka, Mrs. Scrubitt insisted. I can see you're a man of great ingenuity, and we've got the thing for you. The entrepreneurial package. The room's one souvenir a night, but you don't have to pay until six tomorrow. That gives you long enough to earn a few pennies. More than enough, Mrs. Scrubitt really said, beaming. Thank you. Mrs. Scrubitt's lips curled into a sneaky smile. She held out a pen and a contact. Just sign here. It is easy as that. Willie heard a small cough and turned to see Noodle peering through the hedge of the back room. Her eyes wide, she pointed frantically at the contact, grabbing her leg as she were choking, and then dramatically slumped over as she Willie frowned, unable to decipher that he meant if he ate the contract he'd choke to death. Well, he knew that already. Read the small print, Noodle hissed. Pardon? Willie said. Mrs. Scrubitt whipped around and shot Noodle a vicious look. Thank you, Noodle, that be all. And with that she slammed the hatch shut. What was she saying? Willie asked. Who's that then? Mrs. Scrubitt said, her voice high and awkward. The girl, Willie clarified. What girl? Mrs. Scrubitt said. It sounded like read the small print, and there's a lot of it. Willie let the scroll-like context unravel. It unfurled out across the entire length of the room. Oh, you don't want to listen to her, Mr. Wonka. She was put down a laundry chute when she was a baby, and I took her out on the goodness of my heart. And I've done my best, Mrs. Scrubitt explained, but it's left her with a suspicious nature. She sees conspiracy everywhere. Poor girl, Willie said sadly. They're all your standard T's and C's, but you're welcome to take a look, Mrs. Scrubitt said, forcing a grain. All right then, Willie said. I'll give it a once-over. Mrs. Scrubitt glanced nervously at Bleacher as Willie read the small print. Carefully, Bleacher pulled the blood gem from his pocket and began creeping up behind Willie. Okay, that's aha, Willie mumbled, running his finger across the contact. Good, ha! Like what we've done here. Bleacher slowly raised the blood gain over Willie's head. All right, aha, all right, yeah. Well, that all seems to be in order, Willie said. Bleacher quietly pocketed the blue gem as a flourish. Willie signed the contract. He looked at Mrs. Scrubitt, who was as confused as him. Oh, Mrs. Scrubitt finally said, unable to suppress her surprise any longer. Well, in that case, welcome to Scrubitt, Mr. Wonka. Then, an excited skip in the step, she led Willie up a risky staircase in the room. There were photos of Tiddles and big posters that read, Come for the night, stay forever, decorating the walls. It's utterly charming, Mrs. Scrubitt, Willie said. I hope you'll be very comfortable here, Mr. Wonka, she said in a grin. She had reached the topmost room, and she opened the door. Willie gasped. The bed was plump and a four-poster, and there was even a mint in the pillow. A warming fire crackled in the hearth, and up there Willie could see all the domes of the Galeries Gourmet glinting in the moonlight. Sleep well, Mr. Wonka, Mrs. Scrubitt whispered. As the door closed, she turned sharply in her heel and called sweetly, Oh, Noodle! Noodle! But while her voice was a charming melody, her face was growing redder and more furious by the second. Her eyes were bulging and bloodshot, and it was clear that she was ready to explode. Noodle peeked around the corner. Yes, Mrs. Scrubitt, she chimed, but her face all second she caught sight of the raging woman. It was enough to make her little legs shake. Mrs. Scrubitt charged, grabbing Noodle by the ear with a painful pinch. Then she dragged her screaming along the corridor as the way on the far end and kicked open a heavy door. Beyond it was a freezing, frothy, slapping pigeon coop. "No!" Noodle squeaked. "No," Mrs. Scrubitt mimicked with a snort. Her furious hands worked fast, shoving Noodle headfirst towards the railed box and slamming the door shut. Noodle frantically stared at the scrambled door, her little fingernails slipping through the thick pigeon mess that covered every surface. She hated it in the coop, and she hated the smell most of all. It was musty and sour and hideously warm at all once, and it never failed to make her wretched. "You ever interfere in my business again, you'll be in the coop all week. Understand?" Mrs. Scrubitt growled from beyond the door. "Yes, Mrs. Scrubitt," Noodle cried. "Sorry, Mrs. Scrubitt." She tucked her knees under her chin and shivered as the night closed in. There was not another soul in the city with a life more desperate than poor Noodle. Chapter 3. Hoverchuck Goes. The next morning, Willie returned to the Galeries Gourmet. "Ladies and gentlemen of the Galeries Gourmet," he cried. People stopped and stared as Willie struck his cane against the floor. But when he let go, amazingly, the cane didn't fall. Instead, it stayed perfectly upright, as if it was being held there by magic. People began whispering excitedly, and the cluster of customers around him started to multiply. Delighted yet unsurprised by the odd response, Willie cracked his knuckles and then, with a flourish, pressed a button on the side of the cane. A painful-sounding mechanical whir emerged from inside, and a flag began unfurling from the top of it, very slowly and with great difficulty. The crowd inched closer to see more. Willie began whistling with the flag. "Imagine the flag bursting from the cane with a bang," he told his customers. People began to leave. "Aha!" Willie called, getting their attention. "There it is!" He pressed the scissors out of the flag, revealing there was a logo emblazoned on it, an embroidered W, and a little letter glinted so brightly, it curved so pleasingly, it drew the crowd in once more. It was that moment Noodle happened to be passing, huffing and puffing and dragging a larger cart at least 10 times her size. She stopped to watch. "This should be good," she whispered sarcastically. Willie cleared his throat. "My name is Willy Wonka," he said, "and I have to come to show you a marvelous morsel, an incredible, inedible, an unbeatable eatable. So quick enough and listen down." He paused. "No, scratch that, reverse it." Noodle rolled her eyes. "I give you," he said, "my hoverchuck." He pulled a jar from his hat and held it aloft, with his hand shaking so much that the chocolates inside were rattling. They were colored with a blinding yellow, with a green casting, split like wings, and patterned with red spots. They looked more like a magnificent insect than chocolate. "That's chocolate," someone from the crowd chuckled. "With microscopic hoverfly eggs inside," Willie chimed in response. "Fly eggs chocolate? Who is this guy?" someone in the crowd cried. Everyone was whispering now, and the place was electric with excitement. But above the shopping floor, there were owners of the chocolate shop at their offices. It was deadly silent. 3 figures had gathered at their office window to watch the commotion below. Willie hadn't noticed them, but if he had, he would have known instantly who they are. In fact, the whole world would know who they are, because most people eat their chocolate every day. Smugworth, Fickle Grubber, and Prodnose, these 3 great chocolaters. When the eggs hatched, Willie went on as he popped off the lid in the jar. That's when the fun begins. The smell hit the crowd first, and there was a chorus of "mmm" as everyone inhaled the delicious scent. But then something peculiar happened, something that no one had ever seen before. The little chocolates rose up out of the jar and by themselves and hovered in the air. Everyone gasped. Up above, the 3 famous chocolatiers began to sweat. Silkworth turned immediately to his secretary. "Miss Bonbon," he had called, "call the police." Back down below, Willie beamed as the customers hung on the every word. It was going to be better than he had ever imagined. Lots of them were licking their lips. and no one could take their eyes off the chocolate hanging in the air. When he thought of his mother and how proud she would be at that moment, he felt a lump rising in his throat. Is it chocolate? A small child shouted. Noodle chuckled. Billy head out of the jar. Oh, of course it's chocolate. Now, who wants a taste? Well, the crowd went wild in that. There were screams and yells, and people began pulling and pushing, desperate to take a bite. But before Billy could distribute even one of the chocolates, a commanding voice came, "Stop that in the tracks. I'll have a hover chalk." Billy turned and was delighted to see none other than Arthur Slugworth standing behind him. He knew the famous face very well. He'd seen a photo of him once in the newspaper and had committed it to his memory. Slugworth was always there, in his dreams of the future, panting on the back, welcoming to the world of chocolate. He was bigger than flesh, impressive and expensive, clad in the fine suit with glinting gold threading. He'd once heard about Slugworth always wore a suit, even as pajamas. That was how professional he was. "Mr. Slugworth, sir," he said in a bow. "That was an honor. Ever since I was a boy." Slugworth grabbed his hand, pumping it up and down with a bone-crushing handshake. Billy winced as two more chocolate legends fought their way towards the crowd. "Wow," Billy said. "That's quite a handshake, Mr. Slugworth." "It's a business handshake. Lots of people know I mean business. Now, come along." He tapped his watch immediately. "Tick-tock, tick-tock. Get on with all this." Billy noticed the man's watch had stopped and was going to tell Slugworth, but it seemed to be having more trouble with the time. But Pickle Grumper and Prodnose's arrival distracted him. They loomed over him, but not saying a word. "The chocolate's shiny here in flesh," Billy exclaimed, but still they said nothing. Pickle Grumper was tall and spindly, using a handkerchief to wipe his hands. "I touched a few horrible jackets as I came through the crowd," he eventually muttered to Prodnose by the way of explanation. Prodnose was standing stiffly as if he had been ordered to do so. He was short and squat and wore a more colorful suit than the others, a mustard tartan two-piece. His troppy was spread flat on his round head with a professional level of slicking. It was rumored the toppy was made from the hair of his late cat, and Billy found herself standing at it. In many ways it was like meeting four famous people. He had heard a lot about that cat wig, and more people agreed that cat wore it better. "Hurry up, boy," Slugworth boomed. "Let's try one of those so-called hoverchalks then." Billy stepped aside, and Slugworth, Pickle Grubber, and Prodnose pushed past, each plucking a floating chocolate out of the air, and after the other they popped the chocolate into their mouth, and one after the other their faces lit up with exquisite pleasure. "Ooh, ooh, it's not just chocolate, is it?" Slugworth said, unable to hide how much he was enjoying it. "There's marshmallow." "That's right," Billy said, beaming. "Her vet is from the mellow marshes of Peru." "And caramel," Pickle Grubber added, "and it's salted," Billy with a knowing nod, "with the bittersweet tears of a Russian clown." Prodnose began drooling with delight. "And it's that surely not cherry." "Cherry blossom," Billy corrected him. "Cherry picked by the pick of the cherry pickers in the imperial gardens of Japan." As they swallowed, the chocolatiers shot each other worried glances. "Well, Mr. Wonka," Slugworth said, "I'll have to hand it to you. I've been in this business a long time, and I can safely say that all of the chocolate I ever tasted, this is without a doubt the absolute 100%. Billy finally spotted Noodle in the crowd and gave her a thumbs up. "Worst," Slugworth finished. "Why, thank you, that's very wait, what?" Billy cried. Slugworth shook his head gravely. "That we three are the fiercest rivals, but we agree to one thing. A good chocolate should be simple, plain, uncomplicated. Whereas this, with all its bells and whistles," Pickle Grubber wrinkled his nose. "Well, it's just weird," Prodnose said. Billy slumped. He stared at the captivated crowd, feeling the sting of staring eyes. Don't be downhearted, Mr. Wonka, Slugworth said, sniffing a smirk. So you're not a chocolatier. There are many other lines of business. Although I'd avoid fashion, Fickle Grover snorted. A giggle ripped through the crowd. Willie looked down at his crusty plum-colored coat, and suddenly he remembered something. His spirit lifted, a mischievous twinkle flashed in his eyes. Well, there's one more thing that won't change your minds, he said, but I don't know if you want a taste of my chocolate that's weird. You might not like this next bit. Right on cue, Sogbert's feet had left the ground. He was rising up towards the ceiling. His hands were grabbing at air, searching desperately for something to hold on. But he kept going up and up. Wonka! He bellowed. Willie turned to the crowd and in the most teacherly of tones, the hoverfly has broken out of its chocolate cocoon and is flapping its wings with a hummingbird. Next, Fickle Grubber left the ground, and then Prognos. What do you mean a fly's doing this? Prognos screamed. Oh yes, Willie said, but don't worry. It will be completely unharmed. In about 20 minutes, you'll get tired and exit through your rear. Your what? Fickle Grubber yelled. He means he's going to flirt them out on our gardens. Prognos clarified before flipping over backwards and sending his wig falling to the ground. Willie picked it up, and as it did so, he noticed something curious crawl inside. 3 numbers. Give me that, Prognos ground, and Willie hastily threw it back to him. The floating chocolatier caught it and put it back on his head, holding it firmly on the time to gravity was still again. We're off to your walker, Wonka, Slugworth shouted. Who in your right mind would want a chocolate that makes you fly? Hoo, Willie mused. Let's find out, shall we? Who's for a hobbock chalk? In that the crowd lunged at once, a huge hysterical mass of bodies and outstretched arms, all aimed in the jar. There were screams of delight as Willie pressed chocolate into their heads, and the return dropped coins into their pockets. He stood back and beheld the marvelous sight as one by one the rows of birds, more and more of them, went up until the great glass of dome was plastered with a canopy of delighted customers. A woman in feathers had flew past with her dog trap following on his leash behind her, followed by a squealing nun doing somersaults. An old man glided along, hands outstretched, laughing so heartily he was raining tears. Willie stood behind him, flickering a finger back and forth as he was conducting an orchestra, his face alight with fun and laughter. All right, folks, came a shout followed by a whistle, and Willie turned to see the police flying in. Nothing to see here, boomed the man at the front. The big boss, the chief of police. He was decorated with medals and muscle and tall leather boots that squeaked as he moved, arrogant swagger in the chest puffed out. He had fine mustache, which, as they got closer, Willie could see he adorned the chunks of chocolate. Just a small group of people defying the laws of gravity, Chef said. Look, boys. Officers began pulling and floating customers back down to earth, and like plucking stray balloons from the sky. And a similar face approached Willie, a police officer from the day before. I'm not daydreaming. This time, Willie said, no rule breaking here. We're afraid we'd had complaints about you, sir, the police officer said. Complaints? Willie paused, waiting for the man's name. Officer Affable, he said, and yes, complaints that you're disrupting the trade of other businesses. I am regrettably obliged to move you on and confiscate your earnings. The chief nodded to another officer, who marched forward and poured the coins from Willie's pocket. What? Oh no, please, Willie cried. Don't worry, it's going to be a good cause. Sick kids or something, the chief shouted over. I'm sorry, Mr. Wonka, Officer Affable said. Rule is rules. At least give me a silver game, Willie pleaded. I need to pay for my room. Officer Affable glanced over his shoulder to check the chap wasn't looking, and then slipped Willie a single silver coin from his own pocket. Here, he said, and he lowered his voice to a whisper. Now, take my advice and sell your chocolate elsewhere. That's the end of the story. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe. Hani will be back with another story of Wonka. Bye bye.